Okay. Good afternoon and welcome everyone officially to today's first Friday Lunch and Learn for the month of October 2023. My name is Angie Barker Jackson and I'm the Vice President for Institutional Advancement here at Berkeley School of Theology. We are delighted that you have joined today's first Friday Lunch and Learn session. Looks like most of you have already introduced yourself in the chat. If you haven't done that, please do so. And we want to encourage you, no matter where you are, what time it is for you, feel free to enjoy a meal or a snack during our time together. That's why we call it Lunch and Learn. This series is sponsored by and planned by the Alumni Engagement Office. Melissa LeBeff, Assistant Director of Alumni and Donor Engagement, is co-hosting with me today. She'll be monitoring the chat later for your questions. So throughout the presentation, be sure to drop those questions into the chat for the Q&A time following Dr. Brenneman's presentation. Just a reminder also that Melissa is your source for information about future events. We're grateful, Melissa, for all that you do. These Lunch and Learns have been designed with three purposes in mind: learning, connecting, and being. Each month features a different topic and a new guest. Our hope is that topics will stretch and challenge our minds. I think today's falls into that category. That we will connect and reconnect with others in the BST network, and that this will be a space of radical belonging. Today's guest presenter is Reverend Dr. James E. Brenneman, President and Professor of Biblical Studies here at Berkeley School of Theology, where he has served since 2017. Prior to coming to BST, Jim was president of Goshen College in Goshen, Indiana for 12 years. And before that, the founding senior pastor of Pasadena Mennonite Church for 20 years. He holds a bachelor's degree from Goshen College, an MDiv from Fuller, and MA and PhD degrees from Claremont Graduate University. Jim's academic interests are diverse, ranging from natural and biological sciences to Hebrew scripture and Jewish faith and practice. He has written extensively on Old Testament texts, and he is a thoughtful biblical scholar. Jim thrives in the classroom and loves to engage with others. So today we'll get a sample of that passion and thoughtful scholarship as he tackles the topic of violence in the Bible. Knowing Jim's love for all things Jewish and for the Hebrew scriptures, you won't be surprised to learn that he has both traveled solo and led numerous groups on pilgrimage to places in the Holy Land. And I'll just do a shameless plug here. Be sure to watch BST communication channels in the coming few months, because Jim is planning a Holy Land journey for BST constituents in April of 2025. Besides being a scholar, teacher, pastor, and leader, Jim is a lovely human being with a great sense of humor and unending optimism. He has been married to Dr. Terry Brenneman for, I think, 45 years and is the proud father of son Quinn. Jim also follows the sport of racing and is an avid motorcyclist. So welcome, Dr. Brenneman. We're eager to learn about God the executioner. Is genocide sanctioned by God? I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Angie, for that introduction, and greetings to all of you. It's good to be with you today. This isn't your everyday topic to talk about over lunch for many of us, and I hope it doesn't leave a bad taste in your mouth when it's all done and said. Actually, the goal is to do the opposite, to stimulate our thinking and to enjoy this conversation together. In order to do that, I am going to share my screen. Do you see the title screen? Okay, good, thank you. So, God the executioner, is genocide sanctioned by God? Of course, that seems rhetorical to almost everyone you ever ask. The problem is, the answer to this question is not easy for people of the book. people of the Bible. And that's what we're going to be struggling with a bit today. So, the reason for the struggle, there are over 600 passages of explicit violence in the Hebrew Bible, 1,000 verses. I'm going to turn my timer on here. 1,000 verses where God's own violent actions of punishment are described, 100 passages where God expressly commands others to kill, several others where God kills or tries to kill for no apparent reason. Violence is easily the most mentioned activity and central theme of the Hebrew Bible, so says Raymond Schwager. Here's just one of those examples, one of many examples in the book of Joshua. The people, it says, devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword, all in the city, both men, women, children, old folks, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. We'll come back to Joshua in just a minute as our focus point for today, but just be reminded, and then one other example that I think is telling is in 1 Samuel 15:3, in which Saul is told to go and strike down the Amalekites. Now, that word Amalek or Amalekite is found throughout. It's a historic enemy of the Hebrew people, of the Israelites. And so that word becomes a euphemism for othering. So wherever you see Amalekites, you could say, go and strike with destruction by the edge of the sword the Amalekites and devote, or the others among you, and devote their children. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, and camel and donkey. That's a pretty exclusive genocidal comment for sure. So that would give you an example of what we'll be looking at. So we asked the question, do guns kill people or do only people kill people? Let's have a lot of guns. It's really the people, right? Well, let's ask the same thing. Is it true that books don't kill people, people kill people? Well, according to Mika Ball, the great literary scholar, he says the Bible of all books is the most dangerous one, the one that has been endowed with the power to kill. And she ain't wrong in the sense that if you think about the number of guns in America, there are probably 10 times as many Bibles in America and in the world. And so to the extent she has a point, at least rhetorically, to make. And others like her have certainly asked the question. Here's a whole slew of books that you're welcome to, and I just did a select few because starting with one, Unsettling Truths, that talks about ever since the 1492 Doctrine of Discovery, Christians in Manifest Destiny have been killing people by the thousands. With regard to the Native American slaughter here in our own country, one of the cliches of the Christian movement was kill the Indian and save the soul. We know of the Catholic Inquisitions, the Crusades, the Christian imperialist missions, the European wars of religion, and Muslim versus Christian during that time, Catholic versus Protestant. Whatever side one would take, whichever side you were on, the other was the Amalekites. Kill them. American slavery, you see the book Down, Up, and Over. American slavery, the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, Darfur, Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, the killing fields of Cambodia, ISIS, Islamic jihadists, the atomic bomb dropped on a whole bunch of people, Hindu supremacy in India, Israeli settler government movements as well. All of these books in their own ways, not all relating to Christian, but to religious folks in general, that show the histories of millions who have been killed by God-directed, religiously motivated violence. And you remember during the 2011, September 11th, the jihadists were told in the airplane before they went, they were told to meditate on 2 chapters of the Quran, in which it tells Muslims to cast terror and slay the idolaters wherever you find them, arrest them and besiege them and lie ambush everywhere for them, because hell is their home. Now, surprisingly, if you actually do a study of the Islamic scriptures, the Quran is quite a bit less violent than the Christian Bible, just on a comparative basis, so we don't have time to get into that. But even more recently, Matt Shea, a Republican lawyer, pastor, and former member of Congress, he wrote a document while he was in Congress that called the Bible biblical basis for war, in which he said if anyone who supported abortion or didn't condemn gay marriage or communism, then they ought to be killed. And there are others with attitudes like him, such that even in Uganda, they say that homosexuality ought to carry a life sentence. Now, just to be a little more expansive in that regard, even attitudes of Christian leaders who wouldn't advocate killing people per se, they still argue like things like AIDS or starvation or natural disasters are punishments by God for the sins of people. I mean, behind that, you hear that notion of God the executioner. You know, their hands are clean, but certainly God can send floods to kill people who are othered by us. And then the most recent one that I recently saw in the West Bank, when that town of Huwara on the occupied West Bank was attacked by settlers and set fire, and 400 people had to flee their homes. One was killed and others left, and the whole village was ransacked, if you will. And then Israel's Minister of Finance, Bezalel Minister Smotrich, who is he said enough talk about saving villages like this. He went on to say that the deterrence needs to happen immediately. There's no room for mercy. And when someone asked him, well, what about all the children and the young people and the little people, the innocent ones? And he answered, with a quote from Joshua. There we are again. Quote, for it came of the Lord that Israel should destroy enemies utterly and show them no mercy, but they should bring them to be exterminated as the Lord commanded Moses. So it's not just yesterday or 1,000 years ago or 2,000, 3,000, it's current. And that's why people like Christopher Hitchens on this book and many other people who no longer believe in a divine being or God, he wrote the book, God is Not Great, precisely over the poison of the violence attached to the nature of God. So the question is God a moral monster? Now let's step back with regard to that question to this book of Joshua, since it's the most violent book in the Bible. I do a whole class on this. So today you're going to get only 1 point in a whole class, and maybe that'll come down the road at some time. But if we can figure out how best to read and interpret the book of Joshua, it might go a long way in understanding how to address the big questions before us today, and that's what we want to do. And one way of getting at that is to borrow the idea, the conceptual worldview of Marshall McLuhan. He is the Canadian philosopher, educator, and media theorist who anticipated back in the early 80s and before, anticipated today's digital revolution and how the medium, that was his famous statement, that the medium is the message. That is how a document is presented, or the media by which it's presented affects its meaning. And certainly you see illustrated here, whether it's a scroll or a codex that's portable, or whether it's digital, all of those have effect, and you can trace this historically. I don't have time. The great religions arose over media transformations. That's another story. Today, just remember, the medium is the message. And what I'm suggesting here is I want us to look at one particular part of Joshua and suggest this, that the arrangement of the contents of Jesus's Bible is the message as much as the contents themselves. That's my version of saying the medium is the message. In this case, the medium is the way those books are arranged, in Jesus's Bible. And when I say Jesus's Bible, I'm saying the Hebrew Bible, and it isn't the Christian Bible, even in its arrangement, and particularly in its arrangement, and that makes all the difference in the world. So I'm saying the arrangement of the contents of Jesus's Bible determines the overall message of his Bible. The arrangement of the books of Jesus's Bible gives us clues to how to understand its contents. The arrangement of Jesus's Bible is not the arrangement of the Bible that the Christian church uses today. And that difference has been a matter of life and death for many. The arrangement of Jesus's Bible is serves as an interpretive lens in answering the question, is God an executioner? Is genocide sanctioned by God? Is God a moral monster? And just what I don't want us to do when I keep saying Jesus's Bible, Jesus's Bible, Jesus's Bible, I don't want us to answer this question by the explainaways that are often used. That is, the New Testament's better than the Old Testament, or we take Jesus and we read Jesus back into the Older Testament. I am operating from the opposite point of view. In other words, I'm saying, in my humble opinion, we have to look at what Jesus's Bible said and how Jesus read that Bible that made a difference in his own life around these texts. And so it's the opposite direction that we're heading it at one level, but we will talk about that as we go. So let's not use the Jesus card. First of all, it's triumphalism. It's the easy way out of these texts. And I want to make sure that we emphasize Jesus was guided by the arrangement of these texts, not just by their content. And that made a difference in him condoning violence or the kind of God as an executioner. Let's continue. So here's the arrangement of Jesus. So you look on the left-hand side, and I give you the arrangement of the Hebrew Bible. And you'll see already in 190 BCE, the Bible had already begun to be formulated around the Torah, at least the Torah, into three parts: the Torah, the prophets, and the Ketubim, the writings. You've often heard those. So already at 190 BC, this was the case. Jesus himself on the road to Emmaus, he alludes to this three-part Bible. He says, the words that I spoke to you while I was with you, everything written down to me in the Torah of Moses, the prophets, and in his case, he says the Psalms, because there was an eclectic book of writings at that time, or writings being scattered around. So already by Jesus's day, there was three-part Hebrew Bible. Compare that to all of the Christian Bibles. In the one case, you have 5 parts. The standard Protestant Bible, you have Pentateuch, history, poetry, major prophets. In the Christian Bible of the Catholic Orthodox, you have a similar kind of outline, but it's certainly more than 3 components, and the list of the books are in a different order as well. So in the Christian Bibles, it's called history. The second part is called history, not prophets. And you notice they put the prophets all the way down at the bottom, which comes in handy because the argument in the Christian terms is you want to start out with Isaiah, the majors, and you want to go all the way down to Malachi. And what's the last words in the book of Malachi? It promises a Messiah to come. And so that works out rather well. So you can hop, leap, and jump from Malachi to Jesus in the New Testament without a problem. Whereas Malachi is all the way back in the Nevi'im, and we'll see the difference that makes and how the Hebrew Bible says. Okay, so first of all, I still just wanted to point out the Torah, the prophets, and the writings are different. In the Christian Bibles, they're all concerned about the history. In the Hebrew Bible, they're concerned about history too, but it's history with a slant. It's history with a meaning attached to it in a different way than the Christian Bible, and we'll come to look at that. In order to do that, we have to go back in time before the books were ever written, before they were ever finalized. It is a truism in the historical research and biblical criticism and the development even of fairy tales and other books of literature that prior to writing, people sat around in many oral traditions, even to this day, sat around and they told the stories of their ancestors. And in fact, they were sometimes called singers of tales or creative traditionalists. That is, they were given a certain set of parameters by which they could tell the story. Here are three things you got to tell about the story. One, that our family was chosen. Two, that while we were eating pizza every holiday season, one of those years, God came and walked through the wall and called us a special people. And now every single, we can tell that story. Sometimes we can say, well, Uncle and Aunt Jane were there, John was there, Bill was there, but Sally wasn't. But we still have to say every Friday around Christmas time, we go out for pizza. And the reason we do this is because God came in through the wall and chose us as a people. We can't do away with certain parts, even while we embellish or sing, let's say musically, about others. These are sometimes called credos or confessions. So what scholars do is we've looked through the final written form of the Bible. So for now, let's just take the final written form of the Torah, but it goes beyond to the Psalms and Nehemiah and Acts as well. But what scholars have done, we have Gerard Van Rod, a lot of others, but primarily we have looked there. I don't have time today because we're in a rush, but I could give you the 7 criteria by which we decide something is an oral kernel of the Hebrew Bible. The 2 oldest poems in the Hebrew Bible, long before anything else was ever written down, is Exodus 15 and Judges 5. Here are a couple of others. Deuteronomy 6, Joshua 24. Joshua's on the last, it was his last moment in time, and he's giving his last will and testament. So naturally, he's going to go down through the story and say, here's what God did. And he's going to orally tell that to pass on to another generation. Nehemiah, Acts 13 would be another example. So in each one of these cases, you decide by looking at this chart, what are the 3 things that must be told in every single instance? And then you can embellish by adding a few others, depending on your audience, depending on the period of time, depending on what matters and your X point. But the 3 points that made, can you see my little arrow? Was you had to say something about ancestors. A wandering Aramean was my father. He went down into, you had to say something about Egypt. Went down into Egypt, and then God called them up out of Egypt. And sometimes you can tell them about the wilderness or Sinai, but what you have to do is say, God gave them the land that was promised them. In all of the early kernels, those 3 items you see across the chart, and I could give you more, I'm just giving you a sampling. Across the chart, you had to say that you would come from a place that God promised your ancestors land, that you went down and you were in Egypt land, and God brought you up, and God fulfilled God's promises and gave you the land. You had to say those 3 parts. So the question then becomes, if you're going to write your first part, your most sacred part of the whole Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the first written form, and I can make a case for this too, but we don't have time. But if you were going to write the first written form of the Hebrew Bible, in all likelihood, you would have been compelled to at least say those 3 things. You would have had, I'm talking about in the Torah, you would have had to say something about God's promises. You would have had to say something about your ancestors, something about Exodus, coming out of Exodus, and having received the promise. So when they went to compile, at least the final version we have, it is reasonable to imagine that they should have included the book of Joshua, because that was the promise fulfilled. God promised it, and God delivered. So when we actually come down to the final form of the Hebrew Bible, and you see that Joshua was lopped off of it and put in the second part, it's like saying to anyone who was telling the stories of Jesus, tell about Jesus's life, his death, and we leave out the most important part, the resurrection. We just tell the story of Jesus, the 4 Gospels, and we leave out the resurrection in our gospel. The Torah is Israel's gospel. It's their first holy book, their first holy compiled book. As book in the generic sort of sense. So we have to say, what happened that was so significant that allowed them to lop off what would have been the climax of their gospel and put it in the second part, which already has a second level of authority to it? What happened that would allow them to do that? And the only thing that conceivably could have happened that would allow that ever to happen was what we call the Great Babylonian Exile. That is, the land was taken, the elite were imported into Babylon, everything that gave them identity, the priesthood, the temple was destroyed, and they had nothing left. So they couldn't, in their gospel, their Torah, they couldn't simply say that God gave them the land. They're not in the land anymore. And now, why do I know that this is true? Well, then you see this. Where did they put Joshua? They put Joshua in the second part, which is called prophets. And look what comes after Joshua: a narrative, a story that goes from Joshua to 2 Kings. Never, ever, if I can say anything else today, never read Joshua in isolation. Joshua is the introduction that has of a story that has a beginning, a middle, and end. The story begins with Joshua in an amazing genocidal capture of the land, but where does the story end? It ends with the people of God in exile. That's the end of that story. So now not only you have a Torah that they've lopped off but you've put Joshua in the second part. That's the introduction of a story that unraveled, shall we say. So it's like reading the novel A Prayer for Owen Meany. I don't know if you've ever read that, John Irving. It's a masterful novel. By the way, I should say, the writers and redactors and storytellers and collators of the Bible were supremely conscious of the choices they were making. They put this book together this way because it mattered. And so when John Irving writes this, all the way through the book of John Irving's book, A Prayer for Owen Meany, you read about a crocodile. You read a guy who's always dribbling and shooting a basket. All of these little telltale signs that you read about, and you don't know the meaning of it till the last 3 chapters of the whole book. And then suddenly, voila, the revelation comes through that this novel, he was building to a point to tell a massive story. And if you read chapter 1 and thought that was the end of the story, and that's how you should practice or live, you wouldn't know until you got to the end. Okay, you don't know the meaning of Joshua, my point is here, until you get to 2 Kings, the end. And in the last part of and that raises questions about the whole narrative. Now, I have 1,000 illustrations in that narrative alone that shows why the unraveling happened. All the way when the most simple one is they wanted a king like all other kings, and they didn't get it. But that's a whole nother story for another day. But then look where they put the latter prophets. These are like, in generic terms, the prophets are always considered to be like in a courtroom with God. They have to argue the case with God. So what did the collators do? They looked around and they say, what is the evidence? What is the courtroom evidence? What are the exhibits that need to be shared about what got us into exile? The meaning of, and they stacked them up from Isaiah all the way to Malachi to say, God sent us. There were a lot of different prophets. They chose these because they wanted to say, God sent us to make a point. I have to keep watching my time. Okay, let's keep going. I guess we're almost there. Let me see here. So where does that bring us? I will make 3 concluding points, and then we can have a conversation about this. If you haven't got it by now, when I say the arrangement of the content of Jesus's Bible matters, if you look back at the Christian Bible, they wanted us to read they arranged the text in such a way that we would read them historically. And in fact, I should flip back there quickly. Look here. They want us to read Joshua through Esther. They throw in the Psalms, the middle part, and then the major prophets. They want us to, and by the way, they put Nehemiah and Esther here. Look where they put Ruth. They put Ruth back here because historically the story fits there, but it wasn't written then. but they want to tell a long story that ends in Esther and then ends in Malachi because you want to leap into the New Testament. The great irony here is we use every text, we demand in the New Testament that we translate it in its original Hebrew. But when we came to structuring the text, that is the canon of the Christian Bible, we say, oh, the Hebrew doesn't matter anymore. The way the Jesus's Bible was framed doesn't matter anymore. We're going to do it our own way. Around 300 CE of the Common Era, that was ordered that way, precisely when the church came into power. So let's back to my conclusion. Sorry. Why they wanted to conclude something differently. First of all, the answer to the question, is genocide ever sanctioned by God? Is God a moral monster? I'm proposing that we consider the ethical norming embedded in the final arrangement of the content of Jesus's Bible, the one Jesus read, not Christocentric readings, which every Protestant, Catholic, and most biblical scholars use Christocentric readings of the Hebrew Bible. I'm calling mine, and I've written on this elsewhere, and I wrote a whole book called canon Christic readings. That is, we read it from the point of view of Scripture as canon, that is, Scripture as the canon that Jesus read, and how that influenced Jesus instead of the other way around. It saves us from becoming, explaining away the Old Testament, becoming supersessionists, and arguing in that direction. So my first conclusion is ethically that the arrangement of the content of Jesus's Bible undermines its own violent content. And I think I've showed you enough of that. We can talk about it. That is, reading Joshua now from the point of view of exile raises questions. If you read it from Joshua as the climax of holy history, then it's as if God is endorsing what happens in Joshua to use it as we have seen it used for genocide. If you see it in terms of its arrangement in its Hebrew Bible, other people made this decisions, not me. The Holy Spirit guided those folks. And I say they put Joshua as the introduction of saying, maybe raising the question, maybe we shouldn't have done it this way. Okay, so it at least undermines its own violent content. Secondly, it raises questions of divine revelation. Let me look at my time here. Okay. Did the people truly hear the voice of God on matters of violence, or was it their own voice they heard? That's sometimes called the miscarriage view. Did God permit war and violence because of people's disobedience? That's called the concession view. Is there necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between what the texts say about God and God's true intention? Those are questions that are raised. In other words, questions are raised about divine revelation when you start, unless you're going to carry it back and say there was also revelatory power in how it was arranged. I'm good with that, okay? And then finally, it requires us to evaluate and make choices which text in the Bible to follow for our blessing and for our judgment. And here I've written a whole book on canon and called Canons in Conflict. And I don't have time. I'm just running out of time for our sake and our conversation. But there are so many different points of view, including how the world will end, whether it will end peacefully or when it will, or whether it will end violently. Joel or Isaiah, just to give you two examples. And God doesn't answer that question for us. It's up to us to choose. So all prophecies in Scripture from this point on have to be open-ended. And where does the Torah, the great gospel of the Hebrew Bible, it begins with human choice. And where does it end? They're standing on the banks of the Jordan River looking to the promised land. Moses doesn't get to enter, but Moses says, choose this day whom you will serve. The Bible is all about choice and how the world ends, violently or not, which text we choose. And I can give you 1,000 other texts, which we don't have time, that suggest we have lots of choices to make. Let's end there. Let's end there and open it. If you have questions or observations, I'd be happy to take them now. I'm going to stop.
Yes, yeah. So thank you, Dr. Brenneman. Yeah, we are definitely getting questions. So the first is from Professor Joseph Evans, and he asks, if Jesus's Bible arrangement matters, How does this influence, inform, or mislead those who employ canological theology?
Um, well, let me, if I'm understanding the question, you might want to even clarify a little. I don't want to ramble on an answer to a question I'm not quite understanding.
Most,
So, go ahead.
Dr. Brenneman, canonical theology. If we follow the Hebrew Bible's arrangement as we have it today, the New Testament as we have it today, that's the canon.
Right.
Therefore, canonical theology. But if you're saying Jesus's canon is arranged differently, that can influence canonical theology. I'll leave it there and ask you, what are your remarks to that?
Well, first of all, I would probably call them canonical theologies, make it plural, because the Bible is full of different theologies. But yes, I mean, that is central to all my canonical work. Prior to canonical criticism, scholars tended to use what was called historical method. You tried to get back to the early history, the earliest history. The earliest history made it more profound. My version is no, you find out how the canon was shaped, because the medium shapes the message. And Christians today, even scholars today, I think have failed to see this fact. That's why I'm so vociferous about it. And even the father of canon criticism, Brevard Childs and James Sanders, Brevard Childs in a different way just does the old Lutheran New Testament canon with the Old Testament canon. The New Testament trumps the Old, right? That's an easy explanation. James Sanders, also the father of canon criticism, my doctor father, he was too Presbyterian to see what I was seeing. I'm joking, but he wanted to still give God the prerogative to kill whoever God wanted to. He was a strict monotheist in that sense, and he would always say, we don't do ethics for God. And I would always argue with him, if we don't do ethics for God, who does? So, in other words, he would make a distinction between God, what God can and can't do, and who am I to tell what God can and can't do? And Exodus 15 would be an example of that. You know, God was the one who killed the enemies, and the people had no role in it. I don't know if that helps, but we can go on all of these, but if there are other questions, then we'll come back, Joseph.
Yes, thank you. So the next question is from Pastor Jim Hopkins, and he asks, would Menno Simons accept the points you are making?
No. I mean, well, Menno Simons, that's the name that's given to the 16th century monk that created the Mennonite tradition. We're celebrating our 500-year anniversary next year. And it's a pacifist organization. No, Menno Simons, in fact, the whole Mennonite church, like most Protestants and others, except the Mennonite church is pretty more adamant about it. They say what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount trumps everything. So they have what's called a canon within a canon. And everyone tends to, and generally it is, Jesus is the canon within the canon, until you get to people who want to say, well, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus really didn't mean what he said, to love your enemies and to do good. We still should kill some of our enemies, and that's for some future day, some future time. In other words, we look for ways to say, we really don't want that Jesus either. But at least the Mennonites were consistent on that, even if they, like all other Protestants and Catholics, read Jesus back into the Old Testament in ways that were fairly triumphalistic. At least for Mennonites, the triumphalism has to be nonviolent. You absolutely cannot triumph using violence.
Thank you. So the next question is actually an appeal from Professor Eric C.S., and he's going to ask it verbally.
Okay.
Yes, it's kind of long and convoluted because, as Bible scholars, I'm thinking of the details. I'm sure you know.
Oh, yes. Lots of it.
And so this is actually somewhat of a question about what Scripture means, right? Because we walk a little bit of a slippery slope. Now, I get what you're saying with ordering, and I totally agree with the book of Joshua, and I have some disagreements on, I'd have questions about DTR, how does that play in, but that's
Oh,
like,
totally.
yeah.
Those are all.
But yeah, that's like a whole can of worms we don't want to open. But so I get that these narratives of violence are for a destitute people who are in exile, trying to build themselves up into a state that we actually do belong with God. God is protecting us, right? But then comes, Robert Allen Warrior's article in Voices Voices from the Margin, that really shed light on the idea that, that might be the case historically, but the text, all we have is the text, and that's what we have to work with, which makes it problematic. So I'm gonna form this question in an example that might be a little bit controversial. Okay, so bear with me. Do you think that Jesus was a pacifist within the narrative itself? Because I don't think so, but I mean, I can say why I don't think so, but presenting that question, because do we tend to want to, and here's the slippery slope, do we tend to want to shift or to shape the texts that make up the canon, right, into something that is palpable for our just own perspectives always, and it inevitably ends up leaving out other parts, and in the case of searching for pacifism within the biblical narrative, from an interpretive perspective, are we doing the same there, as the example again with Jesus being the pacifist? So hopefully that wasn't too controversial.
Well, no, I mean, because you opened up a whole big can of worms. I would have to go back to Genesis all the way through the rest of the Bible and show you why I think Jesus did the Sermon on the Mount, period. And and even the Apostle Paul's view of Jesus as the scapegoat. So read Rene Girard on this. The
yeah.
was the scapegoat mechanism to reveal to us what the fall was all about. And it wasn't about eating an apple. It was a fall to violence. It was a fall to murder. It was a fall to killing. It was escalating violence. And so Jesus was the pinnacle, such that when Paul would say, when God comes as Jesus, as a human, God as a human, humans will inevitably try to kill God. So mine is a sociological, anthropological argument, almost as much as a theological argument, that Jesus in some ways revealed, that's what Paul uses, revealed where the fall to violence takes us. So if you use that as a trajectory, then I can argue with you here or there and along the way. I mean, we say the same in imprecatory Psalms when it says, dash your babies against some of that was rhetoric, and it's out of oppressed people for sure. So those questions are always negotiable. We'll have to always think hard about them. When does violence enter? How much violence? That's why the whole just war theory was developed, because we get into these moral situations, and I'm a non-foundationalist. I'm not saying this is for every moment, every time. I'm saying the trajectories are there, and that if, we start killing people over their otherness, there's something profound. I think there's something profound, the fact that the Palestinian Authority had a choice to choose Martin Luther King and Gandhi's worldview, and they would be in a very different place than they are today, and I can get into that even more carefully. Pinker has done it well anyway, but I hope that helps. I'm not saying this. I'm saying what the trajectory should be, and it should certainly raise questions about revelation, about who we think God is and what God sanctions or doesn't. And so I guess I would throw the question back to you. Do you think Jesus sanctioned, we can kill 500 people? Or so when you're arguing with God, when Abraham argued with God, let's destroy Sodom. And Abraham is going, God, can't we just find, God says, we'll find you. Anyway, enough said. You are complexifying and problematizing the issue, which is a good thing, and that's what I love. Thank you, Eric.
I will join your class, or take your class actually, if you do the Bible and violence again, when you do it, hopefully. Yeah, because this is great stuff.
Okay.
And we have one more question, and it's from Dean Leanne Snowflesher. In a sentence, what is the message of the ordering of Jesus's canon? What is the message of ordering the XN canon? It literally just says
Christian.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Christian
okay, thank
canon,
you.
yeah. What's
Oh,
the
yeah, yeah.
difference? In other words, what's the difference?
Yeah.
In
Well,
this-
first of all, I would say that Jesus's canon is much more feminine centric than the Christian canon. Okay. That is the wisdom traditions, the third part. We didn't even get to the third part, but it's the third part of the Jesus's canon where Ruth and Esther and where wisdom tradition has come, that wisdom, Sophia is a woman. I do a whole section on the third part of the Hebrew Bible, which literally critiques the Christian version, that sticks Ruth back into the history and doesn't show her in the context of the actual evolution of the canon itself. But back to your point, Jesus's canon is liberating and is a message of choice, of free. That's a very Baptisty thing, is an illustration of leaving us hanging in appropriate times, like standing on the banks of the Jordan River and having to wrestle with whether God's going to come through with us or not. So it's much more Jewish. Surprise. That is, the choices are left to us. The Christian Bible tries to answer the questions for us too readily by putting it in a historical lineup that leads us to Jesus. It's called Heilsgeschichte. That's a whole nother thing, but there's many seminaries that emphasize Heilsgeschichte. You start with ancestors and you go all the way through, highlight the prophets and jump to Jesus. And that's pretty much the New Testament. That's the Christian version, to your point, Leanne. The Hebrew Bible doesn't let you do that because it includes Genesis, the Prolegomena. It sets the salvation history in a much larger worldview. All right.
Okay, so it's but specifically related to the idea of violence and genocide. How does the Jewish ordering differ in what it communicates as compared to the Christian ordering?
Well, let me say it in a real crass way. Well, I mean, at least to this extent, I guess you could see since they both Christian and the Torah, Christian and the Hebrew Bible both have the 5 books of the Torah. So they end the same place, and they put Joshua as the beginning. So one could make the same argument. The problem with the argument is the historical version goes from Joshua to Ruth. In other words, the story never ends. It keeps going till you get to Jesus. Whereas the Hebrew Bible, right after Joshua, it puts Joshua in what's called the former prophets. There is a hard stop there. They don't add Ruth and everything else. There's a hard stop, and where's the hard stop? It stops at the exile. And the Christian Bible doesn't. It keeps going. So that would be a simple way to do that. And then once you see this, you go back through and you go, why did the collators give Joseph 3 chapters, and yet the older brother Judah gets about 20 verses? Or why was the Eden located in Mesopotamia? And why was it a fault of? I mean, you can have complete different reading of all the characters who become archetypes out of an exilic period, not out of their actual historical moment. And I think the Bible, the identity document of the Hebrew people now, isn't necessarily only land, priesthood, temple, but it's have book will travel, have story arranged in a certain way. I can tuck it under my arm, and I can go out of exile. I can go anywhere in the world and still have an identity because it's based on this story, structured in this way.
So it's
You
in,
can't
in
do that in
essence,
Excuse me, I'm so sorry, but we do have one more question and time is running out. I'm really sorry to interrupt.
Well, that's okay.
But I really want to get to this question because it's a really good one. So, Professor Rick Mixon asks, so I have to preach Sunday on Indigenous Peoples Sunday. What should I proclaim? And he also says his sermon title is When God Gets It Wrong.
Yeah, I think, well, certainly you can read, I would start out with the, as you might, with the doctrine of discovery. If you're going to talk about indigenous peoples, you could start out with that. And then I would probably, rather than declaring that God gets it wrong, I would leave it as a question and then invite these kind of conversations to have. Are we hearing God right? And I'm sure you, Rick, you're good at this. I have every confidence that you will leave the people breathless with questions and excitement.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you, Melissa, for moderating the Q&A. Dr. Seas, Dr. Snow Flesher, Dr. Mixon, your questions could keep us going. I might have to just make a plug here for having Dr. Brenneman come back for a part 2 at some point so that we can continue the conversation and so that we can ask more questions. Thank you, Jim, so much for sharing with us today. It was fascinating, and I will join others in saying if a course that includes these topics is ever offered, I would look forward to that very much. So great content and conversation today. Before we log off, there are a few announcements for the BST community. The Alumni Engagement Office is currently taking nominations for the 2023 Distinguished Alum of the Year. So if you know a BST, ABSW, or BBDS alum who is making a difference and embodying our school's values in the world, please nominate them by using the online form that Melissa has linked for you in the chat. There's a special event happening on our campus on Thursday, October 19th. BST's Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Restorative Justice will host New Paradigms for Criminal Justice Reform with Judge Gail Brewster Barriola. Registration will be open until October 17th, and Melissa has also placed the link to that registration in the chat. We're grateful today that the director of the center, Dr. Joseph Evans, has been part of our conversation. And the last announcement is about the next 2 upcoming Lunch and Learns. In November, on Friday the 3rd, Reverend Dr. Laura Jean Torgerson will present Do Syro-Phoenician Lives Matter? Justice, Identities, and How We Read the Bible. So be sure to register and come back for that conversation. And then in December, on Friday the 1st, we will come together in this space for an Advent holiday chapel service. And during that service, as one part of it, Professor Reverend Dr. Sam Park will offer a reflection, a seasonal reflection. So please register for upcoming Lunch and Learns and join us in this space. As always, we are absolutely delighted that you would choose to spend an hour with us on a Friday afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thanks again, Dr. Brenneman, and thank you everyone for being here. Take care until next month.